What's going on, guys? We are back for another recap of the Sunday morning live. I am here to get better and to improve my performance and my advice on each of my Sunday morning lives that I've been doing. Let's get right into it. A lot to learn from this week. I think I had my biggest miss of this week, but a lot went right in week 6 as well. So let's dive into it. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure you're hitting that like and subscribe button to support the channel and these weekly videos and to support the Sunday morning lives. All right. Let's get into it.
All right, I knew we were going to get questions like this, so we got to address the Taysom Hill thing. Let me pull up my tight end rankings because Taysom Hill is in the top 10 for the first time this week, and I probably will have him in the top 10 most weeks going forward. But we can't expect every week to have the type of week Taysom Hill had last week. Obviously, that's almost definitely going to be his best game of the season. He scored 4 touchdowns. I mean, most players don't score even 3 touchdowns in a single game throughout the entire season. Never mind a guy that's only out there for a 5th or 4th of the snaps. I will say, though, with all the injuries to the Saints, I think this has played into more Taysom Hill. So I think you can and should start Taysom Hill in a lot of situations. I am still not starting him over Kyle Pitts, though.
I actually was talked out of this later in the live. I changed my stance on this. And if you guys have been following me for any amount of time, you know, I don't suffer from take lock. I don't lock into takes. As new information presents itself, and as I think about things for longer, I mean, I hold the right to change my opinions, and I actually think you need to be changing your opinions. It's part of the reason I do this recap every week, to learn from my previous week's thought process. I care more about the process than the results. And originally I was pretty adamant that I would be starting Pitts over Taysom Hill. Pitts coming off just a horrible start to the season. Taysom Hill coming off his best game of the year. But Taysom Hill, again, he's not on the field very much. He needs to score touchdowns just like all these other tight ends to have relevant fantasy days. And this week, it happened to be Pitts that scored a touchdown, but I still think playing Taysom over Pitts was a fine process. I think they're really close each week now in the rankings, but he didn't score on any of his 5 rushing attempts this week. So he finishes under 5 fantasy points. This is the same type of situation you're in with most tight ends. Kyle Pitts finally scores, but only has 3 catches. I mean, what is the ceiling, man, for Kyle Pitts? I mean, pretty clearly Taysom Hill has a better ceiling than Kyle Pitts still. So I still think you can play Taysom Hill over Kyle Pitts moving forward. And as much as playing Taysom Hill over Kyle Pitts sucked this week, it actually cost me a loss in one of my leagues. I still think the process of playing Taysom Hill, who has a higher ceiling than Kyle Pitts, we saw close to the Kyle Pitts ceiling this week, I think. He scored a touchdown, his 2nd touchdown of his career. He still barely had more than 10 fantasy points. The volume in the Atlanta passing attack is so low that we just can't be trusting Kyle Pitts that much moving forward. And Taysom Hill does have a higher ceiling.
I'm not at the point where I'm still not ready to drop Allen Robinson. I know a lot of you are probably at that point. I do have him on one team still. And in a 14-man league too, Max, that's the league I have Allen Robinson in too. You can't drop Allen Robinson in a 14-man league.
We were on the money here. Allen Robinson he's being used enough that he can't be dropped. And he had his best week of the season. He still has an extremely low floor. But Allen Robinson, he's in roster purgatory, guys. He's not good enough for us to trust in our starting lineups, but he's not bad enough for us to drop to the waiver wire. And this week just proved that. 17 points from A-Rob, scores a touchdown, has by far his best game of the season. And Cobb got hurt too, so definitely a good move there. But let's continue on with my response. If you see the
you just can't do it. Like it's just not a winning strategy. I don't think. Like, it sucks with Allen Robinson. He's basically just going to be a hole on your team. And Zeke or Deion Jackson, I'd still go Zeke over Deion Jackson again. I think Deion Jackson is one of the biggest trap plays of the week. I don't think Eno Benjamin's a trap. I don't think Kenneth Walker is a trap. I do think Deion Jackson is a trap, and all these guys are supposed to get more.
Deion Jackson was probably my biggest miss of the entire season. He was the number 1 running back in fantasy football this week. I actually played against him in one of my high stakes leagues, 28.1 PPR fantasy points for Deion Jackson. He only had 12 carries, but guys, Deion Jackson had 10 targets, 10 catches for 79 yards. And he rushed for a touchdown. I mean, just insane usage in the passing game for Deion Jackson. I clearly was sleeping on him too much going into this week. I got to adjust, I think, a little bit of how I'm rating these players based on what they've done versus the situation that they're in. I mean, if you, in retrospect, the situation Deion Jackson was in, he's competing for touches with Phillip Lindsay, and he outsnapped Phillip Lindsay in their first game together. I was under the impression that Phillip Lindsay, because he had just come off the street basically before the first game he played in that Thursday night against the Broncos in week 5, that he would get more this week. That's not what happened. Deion Jackson got more run this week, 67% snap share for Deion Jackson. He ran 35 routes. I think that was the most among all running backs this past week. I mean, just such elite usage in the passing game that if JT and Hines miss any more games, he is a guy you got to start in fantasy, though it does sound like JT's back this week, and I think Hines is back this week too, which means Deion Jackson has essentially no value moving forward. But definitely was my biggest miss of the season with Deion Jackson being the number one overall running back in week 6. I thought he was a complete trap, and I faded him really hard on DraftKings too. So lesson learned there, and definitely big L for me in week 6.
Eno Benjamin, he's under 5,000 on DraftKings, and he's basically has the backfield all to himself against the Seahawks, and the Seahawks have stopped nobody this season. Eno Benjamin must start in season long. I think he's the one chalk player that you kind of have to start because he's so cheap that you're able to pay up for Josh Allen. You're able to pay up for Steph Diggs. You're able to pay up for Gabe Davis and still have room for guys like Ramondre Stevenson and Chris Godwin. I mean, I really like the Josh Allen stack again this week. This is my 3rd straight week rocking with the Josh Allen stack. But
3rd straight week with the Josh Allen, Steph Diggs stack. 3rd straight week our DraftKings lineup is cash. So big dub again with the DraftKings lineup. Panthers defense, minimum price defense. They scored a touchdown. Wan'Dale Robinson, essentially a minimum price receiver. He scores a touchdown. Kyle Pitts finally gets the end zone, though we still no real ceiling from Pitts. I don't know if I'll be playing him on DraftKings moving forward after this past week and just how low that passing volume again has been for the Falcons. Chris Godwin, 95 yards, hit the free player prop of the week too. We'll get to that in a second. I actually did tinker with this lineup a little bit, though. I actually ended up taking Pitts out, put Zach Gentry in, and was able to get Jamar Chase in place of Gabe Davis. So even better cash here. The big miss, obviously, was Eno Benjamin, who I thought he was priced too low to fade that chalk, but Eno Benjamin fails to score a touchdown, under 10 fantasy points. And Kenneth Walker, he hits. Deion Jackson, he hits. Ramondre Stevenson, he hits. Most of the chalk ended up hitting. I pivoted off Kenneth Walker more so than Eno. That was a mistake. But I do think just the process of pivoting off of one of those guys was right. You had to pivot off one of these guys. It ended up being Eno. And I guess I got to factor in price a little bit less to the decision of which chalk we should be fading, because it feels like that was a little overweighted in my thought process there. All right, let's keep going.
Guys, I think the Pats win today, by the way. The Pats, and I'm as pessimistic of a Pats fan that you'll find, but it's similar to my rationale last week, and I was all over the Pats over the Lions last week. And part of that was because Dan Campbell has never won a road game as a head coach, but it was also because Jared Goff versus Bill Belichick is just the mismatch of the century. And I kind of feel similar about Jacoby Brissett versus Bill Belichick.
We were on it again with these bad quarterbacks up against Bill Belichick and Jacoby Brissett. Obviously, Bill was familiar with Jacoby. He was the one who drafted Jacoby Brissett and groomed Jacoby Brissett in his first years in the league. And Jacoby Brissett is not very good at quarterback. He's a below average quarterback in the NFL. He's a backup quarterback in the NFL. So I don't know why I was getting so much pushback on the Browns offense struggling in this game. So yeah, we were on the money there with the Browns versus the Patriots. We're also on the money with Ramondre Stevenson, who did finish as the number 2 running back in fantasy football in week 6. I had him in my top 5. Walter in the WalterPicks app actually had him as the number 2 running back this week. So right on the money there from Walter. And moving forward, as expected, Mondre is a top 5 running back in fantasy football when Damian Harris is out.
Jonathan Taylor is struggling behind this Colts offensive line. So yeah, I think Deion Jackson, complete trap this week. I like AJ Dillon way more. I think I would probably lean Dillon over Travis Etienne as well. If it's a PPR league, it's definitely closer. But yeah, I still have a lot of faith in AJ Dillon's workload, guys. He's had at least 16 carries, I think, in 4 out of the 5 games this season. Like the usage, as bad as Dillon's been in fantasy, he has now 4 straight games under 10 fantasy points. He has at least 17 carries now in 2 out of his last 4 games. And he has at least 2 targets in every game except last week. Last week was by far his worst game of the season, 31% snap share, only 6 carries, 0 targets, only ran 3 routes. But I would be shocked if it stays that low for AJ Dillon.
AJ Dillon puts in another brutal performance for fantasy, 9.2 fantasy points. He actually finished as a top 25 running back, though that's not saying that much. He did run more routes, 18 routes compared to the 3 the week prior. He did have more carries, 10 compared to the 6. He did play more snaps, almost 50% of the snaps. But guys, the Packers offensive line creating very little running room for AJ Dillon. He's still going to be behind Aaron Jones. And now he's 1 touchdown through 6 games. It's pretty concerning right now for AJ Dillon. Obviously, I was really high on AJ Dillon going into the season. I've been too high on him basically every single week since week 1. I gotta start knocking down AJ Dillon a little bit in the rankings. He's more like a RB 20 through 30 than he is like RB 10 through 20, which is where I was hoping he would be and was expecting him to be many of the weeks this season. Too high on AJ Dillon again last week. He really needs to be in an obvious positive game script for these big games. And with how bad the Packers offense has been, there might not be obvious positive game scripts for the Packers this season. So definitely concerned for AJ Dillon moving forward. Again, I think he's closer to outside the top 20 running backs than inside the top 20 running backs rest of season.
If you're really digging deep at tight end this week, though, it's Gentry. Gentry on the Pittsburgh Steelers because Pat Freiermuth is out. Zach Gentry had 9 points last week. I mean, that was 9 more points than Dalton Schultz had. He played 60% of the snaps, and it was against a good Buffalo Bills defense. The Steelers are going to get crushed again today, and that's going to be good news for Zach Gentry against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers do have pretty good defense against tight ends as well, but I don't hate Zach Gentry at all. I think he could get another 6+ targets, and that's certainly startable when you're digging deep at tight end.
Zach Gentry, 1 target this week for 1 catch, 4 yards. He did play 64% of the snaps, but an afterthought in this game. And I was way off on this game, as most people were. I mean, the Bucs completely blew this game against a really bad Steelers defense with a ton of injuries. Zach Gentry punting the tight end position. Obviously, we weren't expecting a ton from Zach Gentry, but still pretty disappointing and definitely not a streamer moving forward, even with Pat Freiermuth out.
Thoughts on Jalen Waddle? Yeah, so I think you still have to start Waddle and Tyreek Hill in most situations, not all situations, obviously. But I still think that they have a really high ceiling.
And we were on the money with this as well. I mean, you have to start these Dolphins receivers, guys. Skylar Thompson was starting this game. He didn't end up finishing the game. He got hurt pretty early. Tyreek Hill, 177 yards in this game. I think he scored a touchdown too. No touchdown. He had 15 targets, 12 catches, 177 yards for Tyreek Hill, playing with a combination of Skylar Thompson and Teddy Bridgewater. Almost 30 points, number 3 running back, number 3 receiver this week. And Jalen Waddle did fine too. I mean, Jalen Waddle was also in the top 15 of wide receivers this week. He had 129 yards on 6 catches, also no touchdowns. But yeah, both these guys, they're too good with the ball in their hands, guys. They're too good with the ball in their hands, and they're so obviously getting so much volume each week. They have such a high floor ceiling. They're being schemed touches. I mean, so many of these plays are designed targets towards Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill with Tua returning. I mean, both could be top 10 wide receivers this season.
Why would you start Mariota versus 49ers over Brissett versus New England? It's similar about the Goff versus New England thing. Last week, when a lot of people, I had Goff as a must bench last week, and people were like, why are you benching Goff? Why are you benching Goff? He's a number 6 QB in fantasy heading into week 5. And it was because it's Goff versus Bill. And
Marcus Mariota, 3 times the amount of points as Jacoby Brissett this week. I know on paper the 49ers defense was pretty scary, and the Pats defense maybe not quite as scary. But definitely a good call here, benching Jacoby Brissett, starting Marcus Mariota, who finished with 24 points in week 6. He was a top 10 QB this week. Marcus Mariota was the number 5 quarterback this week. Good call starting him over Russell Wilson as well, which I did advise a few people.
Let's pull up the free player prop pick of the day. It is Chris Godwin over 62.5 receiving yards. Lock this one in, guys. Lock this one in as the layup of the week.
95 yards for Chris Godwin. I was really confident about this one. Pumped to see this one come through. And honestly, Godwin, he could have had a lot more, I think, than he had in this game. And obviously, the Buccaneers played horrible. They blew this game. They really should have won this game against the Steelers. But yeah, elite volume for Chris Godwin, who went from 53% of the snaps last week to 88% of the snaps this week. 12 targets, 6 catches, 95 yards. Again, I still think he left some yards and some points on the field, but still clears this prop with ease. I mean, this prop was maybe 10 yards too low last week. So hopefully we can get a nice streak going with these player props moving forward.
I know both these guys have been bad. I'm playing Juju over Najee in PPR leagues. You want a piece of this Bills game. Juju has been better than people realize. At least the usage has been better than people realize. He has 8 targets in 4 of his 5 games. I mean, if you had told me before the season, without telling me anything else, that Juju was going to get 8+ targets in 4 of his first 5 games, I would have drafted him probably even higher. So yeah, I do like Juju more than Najee.
Najee does find the end zone this week, but Juju still much better play, especially in PPR leagues. Juju only 5 targets, but he caught all 5 of them. 113 yards and a touchdown. You wanted pieces of this game, so definitely a good start with Juju this week, finished as the number 7 wide receiver with 22 fantasy points. He is not a must start every week, but in these games like this one against the Bills that are projected to be really high scoring, I mean, Juju is a pretty safe play each week, a part of one of the best passing offenses in the league. He is going to be their leading receiver this season.
I think McKenzie against the Chiefs in that game, like this is a spot where I'm willing to go McKenzie, even though McKenzie probably projects a little bit worse than Ayuk, because he only plays about half the snaps for the Bills and he is coming off an injury. But his concussion, I think it's safe to assume he's back to 100%. Now, so yeah, I'd take McKenzie at 50% of the snaps against the Chiefs rather than Ayuk at like 90% of the snaps against the Falcons. Yeah.
This was one of my worst takes on the live. Ayuk had a massive day, scored 2 touchdowns. Isaiah McKenzie had one of the worst games I've ever seen from a wide receiver. And I mean, just hearing it back too, in retrospect, I mean, are we really going to play a receiver playing 50% of the snaps over a receiver that ended up playing 91% of the snaps, 11 targets, 8 catches, 83 yards, 2 touchdowns? Ayuk finished as a top 5 wide receiver this week. A huge L, yards, my bad, bro. And moving forward, I mean, we're not benching Ayuk for McKenzie. McKenzie really has an extremely, extremely low floor. And Khalil Shakir had a bigger role than I expected this week too. Khalil Shakir splitting the slot role now with Isaiah McKenzie, really lowering both of their floors pretty tremendously.
I feel like, Chad, every week, I don't know if it's you, but I feel like every week I'm telling everyone to start Michael Pittman, and he's let us down a decent amount this season, but I still feel like he's in must-start territory over these guys. Jeff Wilson's certainly the safest bet here, but when you really look at it for Michael Pittman, like he's had a bad couple of weeks, but he missed week 2, which I feel like is still a small sour taste in people's mouth. But he's played over 90% of the snaps every game he's played. He has at least 6 targets every game he's played, and he's at least 8 targets in 3 of his 4 games. I mean, he's averaging a lot of targets per game. He's averaging 9 targets per game. I mean, that's pretty elite usage.
16 targets for Michael Pittman this week. And this is why we can't be benching a guy like Michael Pittman. He played 98% of the snaps, 16 targets, 13 catches, 134 yards, no touchdowns, still a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football. I mean, that is elite of elite usage. 13 catches. I mean, you just don't see that very often in today's NFL. I mean, Michael Pittman is a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy football. He must be started every single week. And this was a really good game for Matt Ryan. Probably will be one of his best games of the season. But regardless of how good Matt Ryan is, with this type of volume, Michael Pittman has to be locked into your starting lineup moving forward. All right, really quickly, let's just review how these picks against the spread went. We did go over 50% against the spread. We were on the Patriots. We missed on the Ravens. I'm sleeping too much on the Giants pretty clearly. I still think they're a little overrated. The Packers obviously lost the game straight up, so they didn't cover the spread. Vikings, that was an easy one with Skylar Thompson. We hit the Bengals as well. The Cardinals did not come through. The Cardinals are the worst team in the NFC West. I will not be trusting the Cardinals at all through the rest of the season. The Bucs obviously let us down. So a little over 50% against the spread. Not great, not terrible. I think we're at still 51% against the spread on the season. I'm beating the spread. A lot to learn from this past week. Can't sleep on guys like Deion Jackson, who could be in huge roles with those injuries to the Colts backfield. But we got a lot right as well. Another week with the DraftKings lineup caching, another week with the player prop caching, another week with a lot of right start sit decisions. So we move on, we get better, and we're moving on to week 7. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. That is my time. I'll be back with another one of these, recapping the Sunday morning live stream next week. And I'll be dropping 10 players I'm buying or selling in fantasy football later this week. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Time is the most valuable thing we have. Thank you for spending some time with me today. Have a good one.